A bit of a go at creating a more interesting texture in Maya. To date, we've been applying textures mainly by right-clicking on our object and then selecting the Assign New Material and then going through and going through our Assign New Material properties and selecting things through here. We're going to do a similar thing today, but we're going to use the Hypershade Editor because we're going to be making more complex textures and we want more control over them. So I'm just going to delete my sphere there. I'm going to go straight into the Hypershade Editor. So this is the Hypershade. In here we can see the textures that we currently have in our scene. We can see different parts of the textures that we can create. And over here we have something called the node graph, which we're going to be working on quite substantially. The easiest way to work with this is to just create our textures through here. So we can go over here to the Create area and we can pop down to Shader here under Arnold. And you'll see that we have all of these shaders as we would expect to have. And there's this one here, AI Standard Surface, which we always use. So we'll click on that. And you'll see a couple of things happen. First of all, we get a new material appearing up here. And secondly, we see our new, we see a couple of new nodes in here. Nodes are these kind of boxes with these plugs on one side. These plugs on one side are called inputs and plugs on the other side are called outputs. And we can connect inputs with outputs to create relationships between nodes. So this is the final rendered node, and this is the input that goes into this, this output here, goes into this input here. And you can see we can disconnect that and reconnect that like that. We can pop into different kinds of views here. I'm going to use a teapot for this particular experiment. And we can switch between Arnold rendering and hardware rendering. The difference between the two is that hardware rendering is really quick, but the Arnold rendering gives you a more realistic view of what your texture is finally going to look like. So you can see, for example, here that the shine is slightly wrong, the overall texture and tone is slightly different. So we start with hardware because it's nice and quick, and then we'll flip into Arnold when we want to see more detail. The other thing we can do in here is we can change the background environment. So if we choose an interior environment, what will happen is that this kind of environment image will be placed into the scene, and our teapot will be able to reflect that image, which is kind of useful. So we'll leave this as an interior 1 color, and we'll leave our teapot up, but we'll put this back to hardware. Okay, so one of the things you'll see is that our property editor over here is like our attribute editor. When we click on one of these things, the property editor will reflect the properties we can set there. So you should find that this is kind of a familiar series of things from our materials. We've got our base and our specular and all the properties there. So if we wanted to take the specularity of this, we could just drop the weight down here. Or if we wanted to change the color of our teapot, we could change it here. What we actually want to do with this particular exercise is I'm going to make a rusty teapot, and I'm going to use 3 different kinds of input images to affect the quality of the surface. The first one I'm going to use is a diffuse shader, which is going to be plugged into the base color here to change the color of the teapot. And I'm going to use a rust texture I found online. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug a black and white image into the Metalness shader here to make some areas of the teapot metal and other areas of the teapot not metal, so that we can see the effect of like metal shining through from beneath the rust. The third thing I'm going to do is plug a bump map into our geometry area down here. And when I go through all of that and we see it all working, we should get a nice effect out the other side. Okay, so let's begin with looking at changing the diffuse color. So to add the diffuse color, what we want to do is normally we would come in here and we would click on this button here to add an image. Now we could definitely do that, and if we go ahead and do that, what will happen is we'll click there and we'll go on 2D image and file. And what you'll see is a few things happen. First of all, we've added this extra node. It's got a place 2D texture and a file, and that's connecting the output color from the file to the base color. All right, so this is basically saying that our base color is going to get its color from this out color here. We haven't opened an image yet, so we click there. and I'm going to use the image that I downloaded from the internet, which is called rust.jpg, right? So it looks like this. I'm going to click open. What you'll see here is that this rust texture has been applied to our teapot. Now it doesn't look very rusty at the moment because our teapot has all this default specularity on it. So if we take that specularity off, so we'll come back on, we'll click on our standard surface node, and that gives us access to our specularity slider, and we'll take the specularity weight right down to 0. You can see now it looks much more like a rusty teapot. This line down the middle here is because we haven't UV mapped this texture onto the teapot properly. It's not a big drama for us in this exercise, but if you were doing this more professionally, you would want to UV map this properly. Okay, so that's one way we can attach a file to our scene. If we decided we didn't want to have that file attached anymore, we could come over here and we could right click here and we could try to disconnect that. But an easy way to do it in the node editor is just to select over here. We can select and drag over here. Mind you, I'm just moving around this by using the normal MIAM tools. So Option and middle click to pan, and then using my mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these two and we're just going to hit delete, and that just takes the base color off altogether. And you can see it's gone black because when we took it off it set the color back to black. If we want that to go back to white, we can just slide that up again. Okay, so here's our matte white teapot. So next thing we're going to do is we're just going to take our node here. We're going to put the base color back on it again, but instead of using the buttons over here, we're going to do it totally through the node editor. So if we want to add an image, we go over to our 2D textures over here, select file, and you can see that node will be created automatically for us. We can just drag that over to here. And then if we click on this file 1 node, you'll see I've got the same kind of sliders and everything here, and I can click on the file name, select my Rust image, click open, and now when I'm clicked onto this, I can see that Rust image, and then I click over here, I can see my teapot. But my teapot hasn't taken on the Rust image yet because I haven't connected the output color from the image to the base color. So I'll just click here, I get this little cable coming out, and I can just plug that cable into base color. Now you'll see there's some things here that I can't plug it into, they've gone gray. I can plug it into anything that's gone red. So I'll plug it into base color, and bingo, my teapot's got its Rust texture back on it again. So there's 2 ways to connect a texture in. And if you can get in the habit of using the node editor, you'll find that your workflow will speed up a bit. So that's kind of nice, but it would be nicer if we could get some texture on this, because at the moment that's pretty flat, right? It'd be nice if there was a kind of sense that as the light changed, there was some sort of roughness on this. So to do that, we want a bump map. I'm going to disconnect this for a moment. Okay, just so that we can have a bit of a look at the effect of my bump map as I put it on here. So I'm going to add another 2D image. Right, but this time what I'm going to add is I'm going to add an image which is going to be my bump map. So what is a bump map, you might ask? That's a good question. Let's have a look at that. So I'm going to pop into Photoshop. And in Photoshop here, I'm going to load up this Rust image. Okay, so this Rust image is my basic Rust image, and what I want to do is I want to convert this into a black and white image where the white bits in the image represent bits that are kind of sticking up, and the dark bits in the image are the bits that are sort of lower. So there's a nice little tool in Photoshop called, under the filter menu, 3D, called Generate Bump Map, and you can come in here and you can select that. What this will do is it will create a kind of, it'll use the color information in that image to make a sort of guess at creating a bump map. So you can see what it's done here. It's made some of the areas on the image kind of stand out in relief and other areas not. And it's even giving us a preview of what that's going to look like in 3D, which is kind of nice. And you can see here that we've got like some areas here are really bumpy and some areas are quite smooth. That'll do for us now. So we're just going to click on OK. And then I'm going to come up to my file menu here and just save this. I'm going to export it as a PNG file, and I'm going to save it as Rust bump .png. I'm going to save it as a PNG file or a PNG file because PNG files have some nice properties that are good for working with them in 3D. So I click save on that, and I've got a rust bump.png file. Let's pop back into Maya now that I've got that file, and I can go into my 2D textures again, select file, and then I can add my object in here, my rust bump, my rust bump.ping file, this one, and that will work now if I apply that. Now, just before I apply that, I won't do this with the nodes straight away. I'm going to come back over here, and I'll show you how to do this by selecting directly through the standard interface. So if we come down here to geometry, you'll see there's bump mapping here. If we click on this little checkerboard pattern, we can go to 2D textures file, and that will connect all of that up for us. And you might notice that there's an extra little thing in here that we didn't use before. So that extra little thing that's in here is this one called, so there's our file, and in between file and the actual plug here is this bump 2D1. So what this bump 2D1 does is it gives us some extra values that we can work with to adjust how our bumps look. So we'll come over here to the file, and we will select our rust bump.ping, this one. And you'll see that in the preview up here, we can see the bumps appearing there. So it looks like the surface is kind of rough and bumpy. And we can change the amount of bump there is by clicking on this node here and just adjusting the slider value for bump depth. So if we make this like 0.1, you can see that the bumps are still there, but they're only just vaguely there, really subtle. And if we make them 0.5, then they're going to be kind of more. And if we make them like something like 2, then it's going to be like really kind of too much, but really accentuated. We can also put in negative numbers here. So if I put in a -1, it'll look like the bumps go in instead of out. All right, so I'm going to try leaving this at 1, and I'm going to use, the idea is I want to have a sort of a pitted surface on this. And I'm going to add my color back in again. So I'm going to take my node back up here. I'm going to go from out color, and I'm going to put that back into my base color. Okay, now it's hard to see the bump mapping there now because it's covered up by the complexity of the texture, but it will add a subtle extra value of bumpiness to this to this image. You can kind of just make it out as I switch between like a bump of 5 and a bump of 0. So if I go to 0, right, you can see it's like changing there. So it's a subtle difference, but a lot of these subtle differences add together to really create a sense of texture. We could even try it with a -1, right? Let's try -1 because it kind of gives us that dimpled look. All right, so there's my, we're getting pretty good now, right? So, but it'd be nice if we added in a bit of metalness to it as well. So for the metalness, what we want to do is take these areas that are white and we want to make metal shine through in those areas, but areas that are like really rusty, we want that rust texture to stay there. So if I just came back over here and dialed up the metalness value, so that's under base here, if I dialed this metalness value up, then I get this kind of effect, which looks kind of cool, right? It's a nice sort of really shiny copper texture, and the bumps in it are really pronounced and look really cool, but it's not actually exactly what I want, because now it looks like the whole thing, it doesn't look rusty anymore. It looks like it's kind of pitted copper. What I want to do is have the metalness only applying in certain areas of the image. So to do that, I can actually import an image which will tell Maya which bits should be metal and which bits shouldn't be metal. So the way I can do that is I want to create an image that has some transparency in it, and it will interpret the transparency in that image as like a mask to apply here. So let's have a look at how we can create that image. So back over here into Photoshop, I'm going to load up my Rust image again. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my layers, and you'll see that I've got a background layer here which has my Rust on it. I don't want that to be a background image or a background layer, so I'm going to double click on it and rename it to layer 0. Okay, and that means that I can toggle it on and off like this to see the background. And what I want to do is I basically want to select all the light areas of this image and turn it into a black and white image, which I'm then going to save out with transparency. So to do this process, basically what I want to do is create a selection, and then I want to go to a new layer, fill that selection with black, and then save that as a PNG image. So the easiest way to do that in Photoshop is to go up to your select menu and select color range. This allows us to select a bunch of colors based upon what we click on with this eyedropper. We can turn the preview on and off here with this choosing grayscale or none. And this will tell us what's selected. So the bits that are white are going to be selected. So if I click over here on a bit of rust, it means all the rusty areas are going to be selected, and all the black bits here. So if we switch back to grayscale, you can see all the rust bits are selected and all the black bits are not selected. What we want is basically kind of the inverse of that. So if we want, we could click inverse there. And what this is going to give us is basically an image which is telling us that anything we see here which is white, our metal will show through on, and anything here that's black will have a rust color on it. If you want, you can adjust this fuzziness value here to adjust how much of an effect it has. So I don't want too much, so I'm going to dial that back down to about there, because I want plenty of rust still. And then I'm going to OK that, and that will turn that into a selection. Now what I want to do is go to my layers, create a new layer, hide my rust layer, and then on my new layer I want to fill the selection with black color. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, make this, by clicking here I'll make it black and white, and then I can press my Alt and Delete key, and that will fill that selection with that black color. So then if I go Command D, I can see that selection there. It doesn't look like much, but if I save this out as a image, so what I'll do is I'll go File, Export, and quick export as PNG. Here I really do need to save it as a ping. If I don't save this as a ping, then it will actually not store the alpha or the transparency information in the image. So JPEGs can't store transparency information, and that means it won't load properly when I use it in Maya. So I save that image out, and then I can flick back into Maya, and now I'm going to load that. So I'm going to go into my 2D textures here. I'm going to create a new image texture. I'm going to select that image, and here I'm going to select my rust mask image that I just created, right? So it'll come up something like this, the white bits being selected, the gray bits being not selected. Then I'm going to click on open. Okay, and I can see that preview of that image there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this alpha value here, so the alpha is the transparency values, and I'm going to put that into Metalness, but you'll notice that there is no Metalness listed down here. This dot at the top here is for all the less common, so these are like the most common things that people use. This big dot up here is for all the other values. So we click on that one, click other, and you'll see that one of these items listed here will be Metalness, right here. So what's happened here now is that the value of the Metalness is coming from my image, and you can see that I've got some metal color showing through in some of these areas of the image here. So now I'm rendering it in Arnold, and I can get a better look at how this is actually looking. Now, I might have overdone the amount of, underdone the amount of metal that I want on here. So I could try to adjust this a little bit. Let's pop back into hardware for a moment. Yeah, you can see that there's not much metal shining through there. There's a little bit through here. So maybe what we could do is we could try coming back in here and going back into my image and redoing this one. Okay, so I've updated the image there, so I'll come back over to here and I'll just select the image again to make sure it's been properly updated. And then I will take the out alpha and plug that back into Metalness again. Okay, you can see there's a bit more metal in there now. We could also try adjusting our normal value here to make it look a little bit less bumpy. So let's try that. Let's try taking that back to 0 to see what effect that has. Okay, that's kind of nicer, right? We can see more of that shininess through there. In fact, it's possibly a little bit too shiny, but it's okay. So maybe the biggest issue here was the amount of bump I put on there. So let's make that down to minus 0.2. Okay, so that's just a little bit of bumpiness on there. That's probably a bit better. Okay, so here you can see we've got a teapot which still has that shininess on it, but the shininess is kind of like compensated for with the material a bit, with the different layers. So it looks kind of more realistic. I'm going to just do one more thing here. I'm just going to come back over to here because I'm not exactly happy with the way that is. So I'm going to deselect that layer, come back in here, and I'm just going to do a slightly less severe, so somewhere in between the first one and the second one. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do my color range again. And I'm just going to make it more limited. So I'm just going to go turn off invert. So I actually don't want too many colors in here. I'm going to drop this fuzziness down a bit. Yeah, maybe more like something like that. I want these areas here to be pretty black. Alright, that looks okay. So it's okay that. And again, I'll just pop back into this layer. I'll create a new layer just so I don't end up having any troubles. And I will fill that layer. Okay, and then I will save this as my map. Oh, oops. I will export that as a quick ping, and I'll make that rust mask. Back into Maya, and we will reload my mask. Yeah, that's better. I like that way more. So what I've done here by making the it more subtle, I can see that like I've got it sort of like poking through a bit more, but it means the rust is more solid. Like there's no shininess in the rust in some of those rusty areas now. So that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So once I'm happy with that, I can pop back into Arnold and I can re-render this. Even try a different interior. And in Arnold, I might decide that I want, you know, a little bit less of that bumping again. So maybe I'll just pop this bump amount down even lower, like to 0.1 or something. So it's important when you're working on these things to actually have a look at how it looks in Arnold, because the different way that Arnold works with bumps and so on is going to slightly change the effect. And because we're dealing with to get our effect looking exactly right, we're dealing with subtle effects. There's quite a lot we can do. Okay, so that's pretty good. So let's select our standard surface here. Let's rename it. Let's call it rusty metal. Okay, and now we've done that, we've got a rusty metal material. We can close the Hypershade and we can load up a document. We can, you know, load up an object like this, and we can right click on this guy and we can go assign an existing material, and we can assign our rusty metal to that. And if we press the 6 key on our keyboard, we can get like a little bit of a preview of how that's going to look. And then we can do our IPR render on it to have a look at what this actually looks like. Oh, except we don't have any lights, so let's put some lights in there. Arnold. Right, let's render that. Neat. That looks pretty good. It's not got much to reflect here, so there's not a great deal of fun reflection going on there, but as we build up a more complex scene, it's going to look pretty good. So that's building a more complex texture using a number of different layers. There's all sorts of stuff you can change. We can change levels of specularity or metalness, as we've just seen, or other things based upon the surface properties of the object. So give that a go, see what you can come up with. You can do all sorts of things like making a bitumen road look like it's got puddles on some places and not other places. Yeah, really the sky's the limit.